If true, this changes everything, as an NHL insider has revealed that the Chicago Blackhawks are interested in acquiring one of the league's top superstars, and it could happen sooner than anyone realizes. We're going to break it all down in this episode of Hat-Trick HQ, but before we do that, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. About 72% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel. So if you want to stay up to date with everything that's going on in the NHL, from trade rumors to game reactions, all of that good stuff, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Now today, Mark, we have a very interesting report from Elliot Friedman highlighting that the Chicago Blackhawks are going to be very active, not just this season heading into the trade deadline, but this offseason. And again, it could happen at the trade deadline. I think it's very interesting. And he said on 32 Thoughts that it's very likely that the Blackhawks will make a strong push in the summer if Mitch Marner or Mikko Rantanen become available. Now, I think it's very interesting because Rantanen got traded. He hasn't signed an extension yet. That's very interesting. But we're going to focus on Mitch Marner because we don't really know what's going to happen with Rantanen. There's a lot of variables there. Mitch Marner, I think, is actually a much more interesting story at this point in time, because what happens with him in the Toronto Maple Leafs. So what do you think about this initial report? Because it's pretty shocking, and I think honestly it's pretty shocking to Leafs fans, but it looks like, we're going to break it down, but he could be on his way out of Toronto.
And I mean, looking at this, it kind of makes sense from the Chicago standpoint. This is a young team that does have some veterans, but they're not really pushing any farther in the rebuild fields. I mean, you look at the San Jose Sharks, they're coming a long way, but it seems like the Blackhawks are kind of stuck in a situation where they're not improving. So going after top free agents, I mean, a guy like Mitch Marner would come in and immediately make an impact on the wing of Connor Bedard. I mean, if you've seen what Paul Bissonnette said about Connor Bedard, he needs to clean up his game. So getting a responsible defensive forward that can put up almost over 100 points through each season would be the ideal fit for this team to push them a little farther along so they're not a bottom dweller again. But looking at this from the Toronto standpoint, it will get quite interesting because I know we're going to dive into it. But looking at how much Toronto might want to pay him compared to how much he might be asking for, it does favor the Blackhawks, a team that's going to have a lot of cap space to really go out and make a big acquisition in the offseason. Maybe we see him not want to leave Toronto, but once you start getting $3-4 million more than you're being offered from another team, I don't know if you feel the same way, but maybe Mitch might look at this and say, hey, why don't I just take $4 million more? I can go to Chicago, grow with this team.
I think it's going to get very interesting in that way because of the salary cap and the news we just got, which we'll get into in a bit as well. But to get back to your point, I think it's a great point that, when you look at the Chicago Blackhawks, the San Jose Sharks have a lot of really good young players coming up that you can look at and be like, I see where this team is going in the next 3 to 5 years. I understand the vision. I don't understand the Blackhawks vision. I have no idea where this team is going. And it screams to me like the Rangers rebuild where they signed Panarin. It's like, okay, you just accelerated that by like 5 years, right? Like I get it now. You added a top scorer. This screams to me a similar situation to that, where you're going to have to sign somebody in free agency to actually make any bit of difference, because I have no idea what the direction of this team is. That they still have some good prospects, but in the next 3 years, this is looking tough. I'm not sure Bedard is going to get any type of help soon. So to add Mitch Marner to Connor Bedard on that top line, that would make sense for the Chicago Blackhawks. But on the other side of things, like you mentioned too, the salary cap is going to get interesting. We just got a big announcement that it is rising, and quite a bit, almost $10 million every season after this season, year after year. So it's going up a lot. I think we're going to see a lot of superstars take less years so they can re-sign in a couple of years for even more. But I think the most interesting part is at the start of this season, and as you take a look at the Leafs salary cap this year, which is barely anything, the Leafs announced that they have a new internal salary cap. I don't know where that was when Kyle Dubas was in charge, but here we are, right? There's now an internal salary cap that, they don't want to pay Mitch Marner more than Austin Matthews. With this new news that the salary cap's going up so much, I think Mitch Marner is going to be cornered, like you mentioned, to a decision where he's like, do I want to stay in Toronto and make less than Austin Matthews, or do I go to Chicago and make almost the max amount? They'll pay me almost anything I want, right? Because when you look at the cap space, and I want to get your thoughts on this in a second too, Mark, the projected cap space year after year for the Toronto Maple Leafs, next year 36 million, 78 million, stuff like that, right? If you look at the Chicago Blackhawks, sorry, wrong numbers. These are the numbers for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But if you look at the Chicago Blackhawks, 36 million next year, 78 million, and then 93 million. Obviously, you're going to have to re-sign Connor Bedard to his extension at some point. the Blackhawks have way more money to work with. So he can go to Chicago and make a lot of money, or maybe he stays in Toronto. I don't know how you feel about that, Mark, but I think sometimes in hockey and all sports, money could talk.
Yeah, no, that's the biggest thing. I mean, looking at this Toronto team, they want to compete. They're not going to go out and get some ELCs to fill out their top six like Chicago can do. They need to resign Tavares. We know there's extensions coming in for players. They need to continue making the playoff push. So if Mitch does look at them and say, hey, I'm offered $15 million a year for a 7-year deal by the Chicago Blackhawks, with their eternal cap and with looking how they're structuring this team, it's going to get quite dicey. And I genuinely think Brad Treliving might look at him and say, hey, listen, we're not signing to this. Make the decision. Are you hometown boy or do you want to go to Chicago? But just kind of throwing it back to you, do you think possibly a trade would happen? I mean, we see Mikko Rantanen traded.
So this is the other thing I wanted to bring up. You look at the Toronto Maple Leafs salary cap space, and there's rumors that they want to make some big moves right now. They want to go after a second line center because the price for third line centers is too high. So they're like, you know what? Forget that. Let's just solve a problem that we know we're going to have after next year when Tavares is making less money and obviously he's getting older, right? How are they going to make that work? You can't get a second line center when you have $2 million of cap space and nobody wants your spare parts, right? You can't trade away Domi and Reeves because nobody wants those things. So I thought that was very interesting in the way that, Rantanen was traded this year. And when you look at the Chicago Blackhawks, they have $6 million right now in current cap space, $10 million, over $10 million in deadline cap space. So it could get interesting. Do the Leafs look at the roster and go, do we actually think we're good enough to win a Stanley Cup this year? And if the answer is no, I wonder if they go to the Blackhawks and go, hey, listen, we heard you're interested in Mitch Marner this offseason. Are you interested in Mitch Marner right now, right? And then maybe they trade him. They can make a couple other moves like getting a second line center and try and retool for the future. I think it's interesting. I wonder if they start to even consider it now because Rantanen was traded. Colorado is in the mix. They are a contender. They want to win the Stanley Cup, and they traded one of their best players, a big physical force as well. So I think it could get interesting. Mark, do you think a trade could happen? I think it's more unlikely than a Mikko Rantanen trade, but I think if you're the Toronto Maple Leafs, when something that big happens, I think you have to look internally and go, are we good enough? Should we actually get an asset for this guy? Because, by all accounts, he doesn't really want to re-sign for what we can offer him.
I mean, looking at this, if you're going to lose them for nothing, I mean, looking at Patrick Allvin in Vancouver, he made it very clear they don't want to use their players as rentals. If they're not going to sign, they're going to trade them. And I think a lot of teams are heading in that direction. Looking at the Blackhawks roster, though, I mean, you could do a deal of maybe TJ Brody, Nick Foligno, Ilya Mikheyev. That's a complete joke. Do not start with the comments. But looking at the team, you can get a lot of young assets, first-round picks, everything like that to go out to acquire a new center. They want to get a second-line center. Dylan Cousins was a name thrown around. There's a lot of names being thrown around that maybe you get the assets to acquire that player from this trade moving out. Mitch, John Tavares is not getting younger. He's going to eventually go to the wing like we've seen with Steven Stamkos. So maybe you use Tavares as the winger. You move Nylander up. Bobby McMahon looks great. Maybe Domi continues to play with Austin Matthews and looks good like we've seen last year. But Darius, looking at this, would you feel comfortable going into the playoffs if you replace, say, Mitch Marner with Dylan Cousins and another high-impact middle six guy?
Listen, I think Mitch Marner is a really good player. He plays in all situations. He plays on the power play, 5-on-5. He plays on the penalty kill, and he's really effective in all areas, right? And when you look at his stats, even this season, having a career year, he has 71 points already in 53 games. He is going to finally hit the 100-point mark. He's only 27. Again, he's a premier player in this league, but he has never gotten it done for the Leafs in the playoffs. And a lot of people like to make the argument, the other guys haven't either. It's a team sport, right? When you look at the stat breakdown, and it's ironic because he leads the Leafs in playoff points since he got there, since that tenure started. But when you look at it, none of them come after game 2 or 3 of a series. He doesn't come up big. And I think playoffs personally come down to moments, what you do in certain moments. It doesn't matter how many points you put up as long as you win and you play well in certain moments, in key moments. He hasn't been able to do that. So, if I'm the Toronto Maple Leafs, and personally, I would be okay with Mitch Marner leaving this team and the Leafs retooling. That's just the way I look at it because they haven't gotten it done with him, and I feel like he's been the least, putting in the least work out of all of them in the playoffs, the core 4, I should say. I've seen other moments from other guys at least, especially William Nylander for how much flack he catches as well. But if I'm the Toronto Maple Leafs, I look at myself in the mirror right now and I go, is this team good enough? And if the answer is no, then I start to look at Mitch Marner trades because there is a real possibility you lose him this offseason. and you lose him for nothing, right? So I think it could get very interesting. I've always said that the Blackhawks look like a good trade partner for the Leafs, so it could get interesting. But Mark, just to wrap it up, any final thoughts? Do you think Mitch Marner could get traded before this year's NHL trade deadline? I think it's unlikely. I feel like the Leafs are probably just going to ride it out and make a couple other moves. I think that's the most likely thing. But I think it's going to get very interesting. If it comes down to you can't make more than Austin Matthews, I could see a real world where he goes, I can make $5 million a year more somewhere else.
I mean, looking at this, I think it's going to come down to Brad Treliving saying, hey, what is he worth as a rental? If they want to go out, trade a first round pick in a couple of years for a rental player, maybe a prospect, to get someone to add to this team, maybe you just keep Mitch, keep those assets, go with what you can. If it doesn't work, you need to do something. This is a team that's made the second round, twice since 2002, 2004, whatever it might be. This is a team that needs to make an impact this year. So unless you're going out and also just selling your future to make a push this year, I think the best bet's just to keep them, try to figure things out. Worst case, you trade his rights in the offseason. I mean, it's not going to be for a lot, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, it could get very interesting, especially as we head into free agency and the trade deadline. You never know what's going to happen. It's less, some interesting things are less likely to happen in the NHL because there is a lot of no movement clauses, but it's going to get interesting nonetheless. And personally, I would be okay with moving off of Mitch Marner and the Leafs just rejigging the team and trying to, maybe get a second line center and fix some problems ahead of time right now, just because they haven't been able to get it done in the playoffs. So it's going to get very interesting, but we want to hear what you have to say in the comments about Mitch Marner possibly being moved off of in a trade, possibly in free agency, possibly going to the Chicago Blackhawks. They're going to be a big player in free agency. They have a lot of money to work with, and Connor Bedard, a lot of people want to play with him, so it could be very interesting. But let us know in the comments what you think, and if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with everything going on in the NHL.